A number of Canadian charities are breathing a sigh of relief tonight after news that the Trudeau government decided not to appeal a court ruling dealing with charities and their political activities. The Harper government ordered the Canada Revenue Agency to conduct audits of a number of charities to strictly enforce a rule which said that charities would lose their tax-free status if they spent more than 10% of their time on political activities. The Trudeau Liberals promised to scrap those audits and change the law, which they did after an Ontario court ruled in favour of charities and their right to engage in political but non-partisan activity. But despite the new law, the current government had also launched an appeal of that Ontario court ruling. Today, the federal government abandoned that appeal. One of the charities at the centre of the legal battle was Canada Without Poverty. I'm joined now in the studio by the executive director of the group, Leilani Farha. Ms. Farha, thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Pleasure.
Okay, the big question is, many people have tracked this issue, tracked this fight between the federal government and Revenue Canada and a number of charities for years. Is it now completely over?
It's over.
So what happened? I mean, the government finally decided to abandon its appeal, but the government had introduced legislation which basically repealed a lot of the measures, the audits that were threatened against certain charities. So what, in your opinion, what happened?
Yeah, so in some ways it was over when they changed the legislation, because they changed it in a really progressive way and in a way that enabled and now enables charities to do what they need to do in order to advance their charitable purposes. But what makes this sort of the icing on the cake, by abandoning the appeal to our case, they are recognizing that that this isn't just a matter of mere legislation, but rather there is a charter right at stake when you try to limit the way in which charities are able to express themselves. And that charter right is the right to free expression.
The Harper government, for people who haven't been following this, the Harper government brought in or decided to strictly enforce existing tax rules that said you could not have a charitable status if you gave more than 10% of your time to what was described as political activism or political activities or lobbying, if you gave more than 10% of the time. A court ruling, an Ontario court, a high level of court, decided you could not restrict that. That was not constitutionally allowed. So what now will be allowed for charities? What kind of political activity?
Yeah, so the ruling by the Superior Court of Ontario and Justice Ed Morgan was consistent with what was recommended by a panel that was struck by the government themselves. Okay. And it now broadens what activities charities are allowed to do as long as the charity is pursuing its charitable purpose. So you have to have a charitable purpose. You can't just pursue activities for any old purpose. They have to be charitable purposes. And those activities can run the gamut. So whereas before we were restricted in, as you said, to 10% of our activities being what was called political. Political was defined previously as being any attempt to change the mind of the public, any broad calls for support. So if my organization sent out through social media a call for, a new national poverty reduction strategy and, call your MP, that would have been considered political activity. They've shifted away from that and they've said, now we are allowed to engage in public policy dialogue. And so that would enable us to use social media for, in our case, Canada Without Poverty's case, our charitable purpose is the relief of poverty. So now we can, for example, use social media. We can engage in education in a way that we couldn't before.
You can influence public opinion, as you say.
Absolutely.
You can tell people to lobby their MPs or politicians. Can you advocate for a party, a political party?
Absolutely not. And the legislation is really clear on that. And Justice Morgan, in his decision, was clear on that. Our case was never about engaging in partisan political activities or partisan activities at all. And that is still not allowed under the Income Tax Act.
So for charities who get involved, I mean, as you say, your case is you're involved in lobbying to reduce poverty and eliminate poverty. For charities who get involved in a charitable cause, in a social cause, they can lobby public opinion. Can you produce, for example, a guide to party platforms, saying that this platform has this measure and is more, and is, in our opinion, goes further in addressing, say, poverty?
Well, as I understand it, CRA is in the midst of developing a guidance on what would constitute partisan political activity and what, or partisan activity and what would not. And so I don't necessarily know whether a report card might be possible, but I would think that if you're, and I would like to assume that if, as a charity, you are just doing an assessment of the three parties in terms of your charitable purpose, then you should be okay.
I guess a question. This has been a long fight for your particular group, the Canada Without Poverty. There have been more than a dozen other groups that were caught in this and were caught in audits that were still outstanding, that were sort of affected by this. How's this affected your group? Have you spent a lot in terms of legal funds?
Well, we were lucky enough to have pro bono legal counsel offered to us by McCarthy Tetro, and so we didn't have to expend too many of our staff time, et cetera, dollars toward the case, but it did take up a huge amount of our time. It took up a huge amount of our, I would say, psychic energy. It was weighing on us very much. But I want to also be clear that the case was not just about Canada Without Poverty or the other organizations that were under audit. This is a case that affects the entire charitable sector because it was going to the issue of what can be restricted in terms of the charitable sector's activities. So in that way, the case has huge implications. In fact, it may have implications across the Commonwealth. Now,
of course, I mean, just to be the devil's advocate, those who argued for limitations, and obviously there is still a limitation, that is being partisan, and that is taxpayers are inherently giving a benefit to charitable organizations because you're getting a tax-free or certain degree of tax-free status. I mean, so the argument is that the taxpayer is condoning these groups. I was wondering, before we started this interview, you mentioned that in abandoning its appeal, there's even more impact because this is constitutionalizing now the actual status of charities and what they can do politically.
Well, the judgment is very clear that governments cannot restrict the free expression of charities when charities are pursuing their charitable purpose. And so it still is up to governments in this country, or the government, to decide whether or not an organization should be granted charitable status.
And whether your activities correspond to your purpose?
And that's right, whether your activities are actually in pursuit of what has been recognized as a charitable
So
purpose.
you're anticipating a certain level of surveillance, not surveillance is a bad word, but a certain level of oversight all the same, and a certain level of criteria and a certain level of ground rules that you have to play by.
Well, certainly the government should be determining, you know, to which organizations it will and will not grant charitable purpose. In our case, relief of poverty is one of the longest standing purposes, charitable purposes. And so I don't anticipate too much surveillance in that regard.
How long a battle has this been for you?
7 years. Wow. Yeah, so it's long. It's long. And I will say, for my membership, you know, Canada Without Poverty has members. Our board of directors is made up entirely of people with lived experience of poverty. This decision by the government to not appeal, and Justice Morgan's decision in the original case, is very heartfelt. The decision really recognizes how important it is for people living in poverty to be able to engage in public discourse in order to relieve their poverty. And they rely on organizations like Canada Without Poverty to help them have access to public forums. And so the decision really recognizes that, and Justice Morgan was incredibly sensitive to that. I've heard from a number of people living in poverty and other charities representing people living in poverty that this decision is a real game changer and really a historic marker in the country.
Well, I guess on a Friday night you can go home and at least maybe pop a bottle of champagne or raise a glass to this.
Absolutely.
Congratulations. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks so much.